first. All right. Okay, this is where we stopped last week. My nephew, who works at Assumption, found, or the librarian there gave him PDF copy of this book by this guy Goran. What's his name? Goran Ideval, and it has this very intricate concentric structure of the book of Amos. I thought I'll just put it out here for you to see that the book, despite the fact that this man is a businessman, he's a lay preacher in all sense of the word, a lay prophet, and yet clearly very educated with great writing skills. It takes a lot of work to be able to organize your thoughts in this manner, which is very unique. But we're not going to follow this structure. This is just for your enlightenment and to see how intricate the book is. We already did the introduction, so today we will enter into the first set of prophecies, which are basically just relatively short prophecies about different nations. And we will have a look at the map. You see that there's a circling around to the main target, not so much the other nations, but the main target here is the target of Amos's ministry, and that is the northern kingdom of Israel. What is also important about these two chapters is the use of that formula, which I shared with you last week, for four sins of, the 3+1 formula. Though you will notice you don't always get a listing of the 3 sins or the 4 sins in most of the prophecies. Now, the first nation that is targeted here is Damascus. By Damascus, we mean the nation of Syria, which occupies more or less the same region today as in the ancient world, small variations. The ancient city of Damascus sits right next to the modern city of Damascus. They're not far apart, the archaeological sites. One of the primary enemies of Israel through most of their history, during the time of the judges, during the period of the monarchy, was Syria. Because Syria never became a superpower, but it is what we would call a regional power. So it basically governed most of this region. Some say it may have stretched all the way up here. We're not sure. And Damascus is a very ancient city. It's been around for a long time. It's been rebuilt several times, destroyed several times. So in these prophecies, when it says Damascus, it's really talking about the nation of Syria, not just that particular city. So what's the problem with Syria? Now, in this map, what you see are the destruction of the Syrian kingdom by the Assyrian Empire, and then of northern Israel. Okay, you can see that both the Assyrian Empire and the Babylonian Empire, Assyria sat over the Tigris River. Nineveh was on the Tigris River. Babylon is in the southern part with the city sitting on the Euphrates River. That these nations or these empires had a particular mode of operation. When they conquered a kingdom, they believed that the best way to control people is to take them out of their land. And this is why it's very difficult to identify modern Syrians with the ancient Syrians. Modern Syrians are Arabs who basically came up into these empty areas later, in much, much later, hundreds of years later in history. The ancient Syrian, while the language kind of kept, was a very different set of people from the modern day Syrian. This is true for almost all this region of the world. The original peoples are mostly gone. The only indigenous people in this entire part of the world are the Jews. They're the one continuous civilization that have remained from the time of Abraham until today. All the other nations basically disappeared. That includes the empires, the great empires. So the Assyrians took the Syrians out, and they took the Israelites, the northern kingdom, out of the kingdom and scattered them around the world. Damascus was destroyed by the Assyrians in 732 BC. Samaria, the capital of the northern kingdom, was destroyed in 722. So only about 10 years between the two kingdoms disappearing from history. Now, they were told here that their main sin, even though the formula of 3 plus 1 is used, is that they threshed Gilead with iron sledges. We're not sure what this was referring to. Gilead is this region here. It's not part of Syria. So this is probably, it's part of Israel. This is probably some kind of invasion that the Syrians did of the eastern part of Israel. Ancient Israel basically occupied this region here, which is much of modern day Jordan and parts of modern day Israel and parts of modern day Egypt, also all the way into modern day Lebanon, not modern day Syria. So particularly during the time of Solomon, it stretched quite a bit. Now, Gilead, being the eastern half of the kingdom, was often kind of ignored by the kings. You see, the kings of Israel in Samaria were too busy fighting against Damascus sometimes, or against Jerusalem sometimes, or against the Philistines who lived here, or against the Egyptians. And so very often ignored this part. This is where the tribe of Manasseh and Reuben lived. And so the Syrians took advantage of this loophole and launched several invasions of the eastern part of Israel. The modern song From the River to the Sea does not reflect ancient Israel at all, because ancient Israel is not from the river to the sea. It is a whole bigger than it is today. And so you can see the marking here for, let me just change this guy. You can see the marking here for Gilead. This is the area. Apparently, these were very bad invasions. Basically, destroyed the eastern half of the kingdom of Israel. And so God pronounced judgment on Syria, that they would be destroyed, the city would be burned down and destroyed, and they would go into exile. And that took place in 732. Now, Amos probably preached around 750 BC, so it's only a short time from his preaching to the actual destruction of Samaria. You can see the tension in the history here. It was not a long distance. Unlike the preaching of Isaiah, it was about 150, almost 200 years before his talk about the various exiles and so on would take place. Amos's was much more impactful. Okay, just a minute. I have somebody coming in. Sankey. So that is Syria. It's a relatively short narrative space that is afforded. The next one is Gaza. And by Gaza, we mean the Philistine kingdom. The ancient Philistine kingdom stretched over this whole area all the way down to the Egyptian border. The modern Gaza Strip starts from somewhere around here. It's only about 1/3 of the ancient kingdom of the Philistines. At the height of their powers, the Philistines actually covered a big chunk. They were constantly at war with Judah and Israel, even during the time of David. So much of this is Philistine territory. Interestingly, Samson spent most of his time in Philistine territory, but this border was not a fixed border, because there were moments when Israel was stronger, moments when periods when the Philistines were stronger. What we know about the Philistines, based on the Table of Nations in Genesis 10 and in the Psalms in other places, is that the Philistines are not local to the land. They were part of invaders from Europe that were known as the Sea Peoples. They came in 3 waves into the Eastern Mediterranean here, into Egypt, but they didn't succeed in Egypt. They went into Turkey, but they did not succeed there. They ended up settling here, the Eastern Mediterranean coast. The reason they chose the coastal area is because the Philistines, the Bible says, came from a place called Kaftor. Now, Kaftor is the ancient Hebrew name for the island of Crete. And so they were, southern Mediterranean. There is a theory that they may have been part of the Viking invasions of the Mediterranean, but that is very, very unlikely because the Vikings came much, much later. So they settled here and they had higher technology through all of their history. They already had iron weapons, while the Israelites, the best metal they had was bronze. And this is why you can understand nobody wanting to fight Goliath, because his sword was iron. The best swordsman in Israel had only a bronze sword. And there's no contestation. This iron sword would just cut the bronze sword in half if they were hand-to-hand combat. And so it was difficult. That's why the Israelites depended a lot on these long-distance weapons, the slings. And David knew how to fight Goliath by using a sling, never mind the sword. Hand-to-hand would not work. Their technology was superior. But Israel had a different technology, the sling stone. Think of it like a missile. But the war between these two nations carried on for centuries, all the way down to the end of the monarchy, the Babylonian exile. They were still there. There's a little bit of confusion as to when exactly they finally disappeared from history. The sin of the Philistines, they exiled a whole community, handing them over to Edom. What happened during the exile of the northern kingdom and also later of Judah, so some of this is prophetic, the Philistines took advantage to capture runaways. Israelites who were running away from the Assyrians were captured by the Philistines and sold as slaves to Edom. And Jewish or Judah people who tried to run away to Egypt, but Philistines stood in the way. They captured them and sold them as slaves. You can see that some of this history has never changed. It's always kind of remained. The races may have changed, but the mentality of the land, the personality of this land has really remained more or less the same. And the punishment, like with with Syria, would be total destruction of the kingdom and people. But this would not happen in one moment like Syria. It would take several centuries or several episodes before that would actually take place. The next city or nation is Tyre. Tyre was the #1 city in the ancient world of a kingdom known as Phoenicia. Now, those of you who teach language in any sense, I hope you remember that the alphabet system of writing was invented by the Phoenicians, the ABCD that would govern the entire Mediterranean world and become the dominant writing script of the world. That came from Phoenicia. Today we know it as Lebanon, though ancient Phoenicia is a larger territory than modern day Lebanon. Let me see, there's somebody else. All right. Now, what was the sin of Phoenicia? Now, Phoenicia had an interesting relationship with Israel. When Solomon was building his temple, his main ally who provided him with the best wood, with engineers and construction supervisors, was Hiram, the king of Tyre. Okay, and so in the early monarchy period, there was a strong relationship between these two kingdoms. They both belong to the Semitic family of languages. But the relationship turned sour in history, and they did the same thing as the Philistines, capture these runaways Israelites who were trying to get away from the Assyrians, and then sell them off as slaves to the Edomites. Okay, now In addition, we have two things mentioned about Tyre or about Lebanon, that they actually had a treaty, a peace treaty with Israel. But when they saw Israel being attacked, and they took advantage of breaking that treaty, realizing that Israel is going to be gone from history. This is the nation. This is the pattern even until today's world. That when two nations sign an MOU, but one nation sees a loophole, they will invade. They will try to take territory. It's still happening. It's happening in Europe. It happened, that led to all the wars. It's what allowed colonialism to happen. It's happening today in the main wars that are occurring in the world. So the world has not changed that much. Just the players have changed. Now, this is very interesting because the prophecy is that Tyre will be burnt down. Now, the city of Tyre is actually an island off the coast and was so proud of the fact that no one could actually capture it. And they had a magnificent fortress. It took Nebuchadnezzar about 13 years to capture the city of Tyre. Okay, so the whole time that he was invading Judah, Israel was gone already. The whole time that he was invading Judah, he was also trying to get into Tyre. And so when he finally got into Tyre, using ships and pontoon boats and so on, he burned down most of the city. But the city was apparently rich enough, they quickly rebuilt. And it was finally brought to its knees by Alexander the Great. Unlike Nebuchadnezzar, Alexander, but even for him, it took many years, he decided to build a causeway. So essentially creating a land bridge between the mainland and the city of Tyre. And eventually he captured it. And after Alexander the Great, Tyre basically disappeared in importance in history. They were the dominant maritime city of the first millennium BC. So this is quite a turnaround. They were not burned literally, physically, but economically they would lose their control, their importance. However, the Phoenicians left us the alphabet system. Can you imagine what our lives would be like today without this alphabet system of writing? Those of us who have had a chance to look a little bit at things like Sumerian and hieroglyphs and those kinds of writings, it's amazing. The alphabet system changed the world, made communication much easier. And so there are traces in the world of literature, at least, of the Phoenicians. And maritime trade was something that they also developed. So their demise, unlike Syria, which was quite rapid, and the Philistines, which took longer, the Phoenicians, it was not a total decimation. They didn't completely disappear from history. However, we need to be careful that when you look at modern day Lebanon, the closest to the ancient Phoenicians, the indigenous Phoenicians, would be the Maronite Christians, not the Muslims. The Muslims were part of the invasions that came about in the 7th century AD and eventually took over this entire Middle East region. So the Maronite Christians are the closest indigenous people to the ancient Phoenicians. Now, you know that the Christian gospel was very active in Phoenicia. Even in Old Testament times, Elijah stayed in the city of Zarephath for 3 years during that famine. That Jesus may have traveled to Sidon. Well, now I believe that he traveled much further than that, but at least to Sidon. And the other disciples traveled this region. Paul traveled through this whole, there were ports all along here for traveling across the Mediterranean. Okay, the next target is the kingdom of Edom. Now, in this map, you can see all these various kingdoms. This light green one here, this is the northern kingdom of Israel. This bluish one here is the kingdom of Judah. This is the divided monarchy period. the Philistines occupied this area. Modern day Gaza is just along here. And the Nabatew people here, which later would establish one of the great empires of the desert, known as the Nabateans, who would build one of the most magnificent cities in the ancient world called the city of Petra. All of this is now Jordan, okay, and from here downwards, it's all Saudi Arabia. The Arameans, kingdom here, Ammon here, Moab here, and the Arabu people. This is another name for the Arabs, but they were not really such a famous kingdom at the time. Now, here's the thing. Edom is the people who descended from Esau, the brother of Jacob. Ammon and Moab were descendants of Lot. And so throughout the history of Israel, Judges, united monarchy, divided monarchy, these three kingdoms were standing enemies of Israel. There was never a moment of peace between these three kingdoms. Now, they were never stronger than Israel at any point in history, but whenever there was some weakness, like some civil war in Israel, the division of the kingdom, or Israel was being attacked by outside powers, they often took advantage of that. They were really nasty towards Judah during the Babylonian invasion, and you can read about what Edom did to the people of Judah who were trying to get away from Nebuchadnezzar in the book of Obadiah. The book of Obadiah is based entirely against the kingdom of Edom. So this kingdom was one of the standing enemies. No peace with Israel. These three kingdoms, Ammon, Moab, and Edom, had a mission, a kind of an unwritten mission statement that they want to see the permanent destruction of Israel. Now, translate that into modern day terms, and you can see that mentality hasn't changed in this geography. History is such an uncomfortable subject, but it helps to explain why we are where we are today. With Edom, because of the greater degree of what they did that God found repulsive, we have a longer listing. In fact, 4 items. Pursued his brothers with the sword. Okay, so those people who were trying to run away from Nebuchadnezzar towards Egypt, they fell prey to the Edomites. He stifled his compassion. Okay, so they were brothers, they were cousin nations, but that didn't matter, just like it doesn't today. His anger tore at them continually, so they were always jealous of Israel, always trying to make trouble, and he harbored his rage incessantly. The Edomites did things to those refugees, those Jewish refugees trying to get away from Nebuchadnezzar, that are very similar to what Hamas did recently. As a Bible teacher who also understands and has been through the detailed history of the ancient world, you kind of wonder, is there, I'm writing an essay right now about God gave Abraham this land, but is it really a promised land? Or is it a land of curses? My contention is that God brought Abraham to try and reverse the curse on the land. By the way, the curse on the land, this particular land, started all the way back in Genesis chapter 9, 10, 11, and so on. So there was an ancient divine curse on this land, and this land will never have peace until the Messiah comes and establishes his kingdom. That is the belief of the Jewish faith and the Christian faith as well. So even in the heydays of Solomon's kingdom, Solomon subjugated all these nations. His kingdom stretched all the way down here into Saudi Arabia. They subjugated them. But the moment Solomon's kingdom broke off in half and they became weak, they quickly retook their territory and then would attack Judah and Israel over and over and over again, especially when those superpowers began to invade the land. The punishment is that the kingdom and the cities of Edom will be destroyed. The Edomites will disappear from history. There is not, other than archaeological excavations, there is no trace of the Edomites. What happened to them? The descendants of Esau harbored the same hatred towards the brothers, their cousins, that Esau had towards Jacob. Esau never really forgave Jacob. There was some reconciliation, but when you read Genesis very carefully and you get to the part where it talks about the final separation between the two, you can see that the separation was not an amicable one. There was some hard feelings between the brothers that never went away. And so those descendants of Esau that established the kingdom of Edom, they carried that. This is the problem with this Middle East region. People carry their hatred of each other through the generations, not just for centuries, but for millennia. It infects anybody who moves into this kingdom. Now, the Assyrians had this unfortunate thing they did. When they took the Syrians out and Israel out, they brought other people in. Now, some of those people that they brought in to occupy the land were people that they captured from invasions of these other tribes all around, brought them to settle the land. And that's where history began to turn on its head and keeps turning even today. The next kingdom targeted, notice how it started: Syria, Israel, Philistines, Edom, then it goes to Ammon. Ammon was one of the sons of Lot from one of his daughters, in that drunken stupor after escaping from Sodom and Gomorrah. So these two kingdoms were cursed from the beginning, just like in Genesis, the Canaanites were cursed. In Genesis, Ammon and Moab were also cursed, and Edom was deprived of the birthrights. There is a Jewish rabbi who says that there are two kinds of Palestinians and Arabs in relationship to the Jews. There is the Esau mentality, hunters. That's what the kingdom of Edom did. A hunter is interested in trophies. And so when the Hamas fighters wore body cams so they can advertise on social media of how they killed and maimed and chopped people's heads off and raped and everything, that was a trophy. But the other one is the Ishmael problem. The Ishmael problem is the problem of inheritance. And the whole difficulty about this land is who inherits this land. Now, God promised this land to Abraham, but when Abraham was promised this land, it was not an empty land. There were many tribes of people, small little tribal kingdoms, warlords that ruled through the land. God even named 10 specific nations that lived in this region, that God says this land will belong to you. And they were all descendants of Canaan, who was the son of Ham, who were all cursed from the time of Noah. So this is a history is extremely complex, but it also helps to explain the complexity of relationships today. And this intermixing of people, generation after generation, first because of the Assyrian exile, and then the Babylonian exile, and then because of the Greeks, and then the Romans, and the Nabatean empires, and then the Muslim empires later. Nobody really knows. The longest continuous group of people in this land, indigenous to this land, were the descendants of Abraham, who can trace their origins to Abraham's time. Because there is no more Canaanite, there's no more Philistine, there's no more Edomites, there's no more Ammon. All of these disappeared in history. The whole region today is occupied by Arabs who came from somewhere else. They ripped open the pregnant women of Gilead in order to enlarge their territory. Think of what this is saying. Remember what happened in October 7. When Ammon invaded Gilead, this is the region of Gilead. Gilead is up here, but part of this is Gilead too. When they invaded, tried to take this territory, not so much this part, from Israel, because now Israel was weak, their method of invasion was gross. It was horrific. It was barbarous. Okay. Read what Amos is saying. And so what does God say? Destruction and exile. And they would disappear from history. Moab, the last of the nations targeted. So we go from here, down here, outside, before we come into the kingdom proper. Okay, so all of these kingdoms are targeted. Moab, another descendant of Lot. Their sin, they burned the bones of the kingdom of Edom to lime. They are relatives of each other. All these nations, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, these are cousins, brothers. Okay. Their sin was not so much attacking Israel and Judah, but attacking Edom. And so God finds that unacceptable. Kingdom will be destroyed. Notice the common theme. So after finishing all these other nations around, now God comes to Judah. Okay. If you look at the purple line on the map, this is the first exile of the 10 tribes. 722 by 2122 by the Assyrians. The Israelites were taken and scattered all over Turkey and Iran, Babylon, Nineveh, all the way north up here, what we would call Armenia today. These tribes were scattered. We know that some of them actually ran away, got away from the Assyrians, and joined themselves with Judah down here. And so when you speak about Judah, it's not actually just the tribe of Judah. It's a lot of other tribes were also absorbed into the kingdom of Judah. The whole tribe of Levi, for example, was fully absorbed. When the Babylonians came, they took the Jews that they thought were useful to them, they took them to Babylon and settled them around here. Eventually, the Jews would spread all the way to Iran, all the way to the Afghanistan region, Central Asia. And they would actually merge with these other tribes that were already there a few years earlier, about a century earlier. So the idea that the 10 tribes were totally lost in history is not factual. Yes, they lost their identity. Partly they were absorbed into the main tribe of Judah as a result of these migrations. They integrated with other societies. They maintained some concept that they were still in existence. There is a tribe in Manipur I spoke about last week who believe they are descendants of Manasseh. The strongest archaeological evidence we have is of the tribe of Gad, who lived in the Gilead region, who seem to have migrated across the Mediterranean all the way to Spain. Okay, so, or at least a small remnant of them that scattered all the way to Spain. During the Babylonian exile, the people who were not taken by Nebuchadnezzar, they thought he will come back for them. So they ran away. A large group of them ran away into Egypt and established a very large community of Jews on an island on the Nile called Elephantine Island. And we would develop two versions of Judaism post Nebuchadnezzar period. The Babylonian version of Judaism and the Egyptian or Elephantine version of Judaism. They worked very hard to preserve the scrolls, began to make copies of the Bible, the Old Testament, so did the ones over here. And so this is a very important part of history for us to remember, to know. All right, so what was the sins of Judah? Now, this is interesting. Their sins are more spiritual, not military or political. They have rejected the instruction of the Lord, basically saying they have rejected the Torah and have not kept his statutes. Okay. We know by the time of Josiah, people had even forgotten where the scrolls were. And then a second group of sins is this: the lies that their ancestors followed have led them astray. In other words, they listened to these false prophets that preceded the actual exile and followed their advice. Many of the kings did that, as well as leaders, elders, and general population. Now, we don't know exactly what lies he was referring to, but when we scan through all the prophet writings and books like Chronicles and Kings, we can conjecture some of the lies. One of the lies was that they are the chosen people of God, so God will never fully punish them. They only woke up from that lie in Babylon. Another lie is, it's yes, you can worship Yahweh, but it's okay to worship all the other gods. And so they built altars and bemas and Asherah poles to all the gods of the Canaanites and Egyptians and everything and so on. They lived with the mentality of, we want to be like them. Another clear lie is, if everybody around us has a king, we want to have a king too. When Samuel tried to dissuade them, they said, no, 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 we want to be like the world. By the way, this lie still affects contemporary church. One of the most visible impact of this lie in today's Christianity is this. The world measures everything by what are known as the key productivity uh, indices or whatever, the KPIs. And so every school, every company, every organization, from the UN down to a little school somewhere in Thailand, they have KPIs by which teachers are measured. Now, in the last century or so, Christianity, particularly Protestant Christianity, has gone into that game. And so every pastor today, including every Adventist pastor, is measured by tangible KPIs. How many baptisms have you had? How much tithe has increased? How have you grown the district and the offering system? How many Bible studies have you given? How many sermons do you preach? You may not know this if you don't work for the church, but pastors have to fill up a monthly report with all of these things listed and showing the numbers. If your numbers are not right, then you either get deduction or salaries withheld in some missions until you catch up with the numbers. These days, they don't do that so much. What they do is it affects your increment, your upward mobility. And so the end result is that a lot of pastors, and I've had to work with this problem before, they simply fake their reports in order to make sure that they get their next year's increment. It's a very sad thing, but it happens in all organizations. When you measure success by KPIs, people are going to play games because they can't always meet those KPIs. Now, interestingly, the prophets and the apostles and the elders of the New Testament and the Old Testament are the closest to the modern day pastor office. Bring them into our world, apply the KPIs to them, and every single one of them will fail. The only prophet I know who probably would pass is Haggai. Everyone else, including Jesus, would fail. Because in the Bible, you are not measured by success. In fact, some of these prophets, Amos was one of them, were actually told by God that they will have no success whatsoever. Jeremiah was told that his lack of success will be the measure of his calling. Isaiah was told that nobody is going to pay attention to you. He would write one of the most magnificent documents of the Bible, and yet nobody cared to listen, not in his lifetime. And so Bible prophets were prophets simply because of loyalty to God. They fail all the measurements by human standards. That's why Amos told the high priest Amaziah, I'm not a prophet. I'm not a professional prophet, if you recall last week's lesson. If you measure me by that, of course I'm going to fail because I'm not a prophet, but I do have a message from God and that's all I can do. And so Judah, the kingdom that still had the temple, that still controlled Jerusalem, they had walked away from God. Josiah, the last good king, when they discovered the scroll of the Torah in the temple as they were repairing it, He was so shocked at how far they were from the will of God. And so he launched this massive reformation to try and bring people back into relationship with God. It didn't work. About 50 years after he died, the people were in Babylon or Egypt, depending on which direction you moved. Punishment would be heavy, destruction of the kingdom and Jerusalem, which implied the temple as well. And this would be the ending of the first temple period, 586 BC. The Jewish exile, by the way, took place in 3 phases. In 605, okay, where people like, we're not sure who were taken, but a very small group. In 597, where you have people like Ezekiel that were taken, if you recall from our Ezekiel study. And then the final one, when Jerusalem itself was destroyed, the temple was burned down, 586, Daniel and the biggest group that were removed from that land. Now, the quirk of history is that when the Persians became the superpower and conquered all these other powers all over, one of the first things that Cyrus did is to allow the Jews to return home. The Persians had a really warm and close relationship with the Jewish people. The Persian emperors, at least 3-4 of them, did not just send the Jews back home. They sent soldiers to God, like with Nehemiah's case. They gave money. They funded the rebuilding of the temple. We don't know this. In today's world, the nation that is the number one deadly enemy of Israel is Iran, or modern-day Persia. History not only goes in circles and in complex forms, but it also can revert very easily. Another quirk of history. This punishment of the Jews would not be permanent, but it launches a series of diasporas. The Jewish people had to face several diasporas in their history, again and again and again. And if the Arabs and the Palestinians have their will today, there would be another diaspora even in the 21st century. It's almost like a permanent punishment that God gave these people for these sins. If you're going to ignore me, then you will live in uncertainty. But the main target of Amos was not Judah. It was Israel, the neighbor. In terms of territory, the northern kingdom was about 3 times larger than the kingdom of Judah. But in terms of lifespan, the kingdom of Judah outlasted Israel by about 150 years, so far more successful. And the main reason is this: there was only one dynasty in Judah. All the kings, from Rehoboam down to Zedekiah, they all came from the same family. They were descendants of David and Solomon, whereas the northern kingdom had several different dynasties. About half of the kings, or one, not half, about a third of the kings of northern Israel were assassinated by the person who then took over the kingdom. So very, very violent history. Okay, when it comes to Israel, the 3+1 listing becomes very complete. God says that the number one sin is they sell the righteous person for silver and the needy for a pair of sandals. In other words, there was a rampant corruption in the kingdom, uncontrolled corruption. They trample the heads of the poor and block the path of the needy. There was social injustice. A man and his father having sexual relations with the same girl, gross immorality, something that the Canaanites thought was a great thing to do. And so these people copied. The kingdom of Israel literally rejected the religion of Abraham, the religion of Moses. They built their own temple. They had their own priesthood, their own prophets. They built a counter temple, a counter religious system, drove out all the priests, all the Levites into the kingdom of Judah. This is what they had done. They stretch out beside every altar. So to Baal, to Asherah, to whoever, Molech and everything else. One of the kings even sacrificed his son on an altar of Molech, even Judah's kings. Garments taken as collateral, and in the house of their God, they drink wine obtained through fines. In other words, corrupted religiosity. They were mixing the holy and the unholy. And if you know anything about Torah law, that's the essence of sin, mixing holy and unholy. And so God declares certain things holy and other things unholy or clean and unclean. And the moment you mix them, there would be destruction. So when you read all those unexplainable deaths and destructions and judgments in the Old Testament, almost all of them boil down to this one particular sin. And so here you get a full listing of the 3+1 formula. And it's the +1 that is the big one, the mixing of the holy and the unholy. Their religion had become completely corrupted. And God spells out the reasons for his judgment, since they are the main target. One reason is that they don't appreciate their own history. And so they're going to be judged because they don't understand where they've come from. They don't appreciate what God has done for them in the past. Secondly, they twisted the godly, forcing the two groups that were dedicated completely to God, Nazarites and prophets, forcing them, for example, forcing the Nazarites to drink wine. Nazarites were not allowed to drink wine. Forcing the prophets to either leave the kingdom, Elijah had to leave the land for 3 years, or try to compel them to speak falsehood, and this was done institutionally, not just at the personal level. And so their punishment, they will be crushed. And the Assyrians were a very violent empire, and there will be no escape. Unlike Judah, where a huge number of people escaped into Egypt because Nebuchadnezzar didn't care about everybody, the Assyrians, they captured almost everybody. The few that did escape, the smaller groups that escaped, were then captured by the Ammonites or the Edomites or the Philistines. No escape for anyone. And he says that all their strength and skills, they had some great kings. For example, Jeroboam II. He shall be, you saw about him last week, the parallel with Uzziah. He was a great king. He won some wars. He built up the kingdom. He enlarged its territory. But he says, God says to them, all your strength and skill will be futile. Now, militarily, Israel was one of the regional powers. That's why they were constantly fighting against Judah. They were able to subjugate the Ammonites and Moabites to some extent. They had wars with the Syrians. But when the Assyrians came by, they just couldn't stand. The city of Samaria fell. The Assyrians were known for their cruelty, the way they treated their prisoners of war, marching them into exile. They would put hooks in their noses and then iron chains from around their neck to the other person's nose, around the neck to the other person's nose. Even King Manasseh, who actually got caught up by the Assyrians because he joined Israel in the fight against the Assyrians, there is writing and murals in Nineveh that shows Manasseh being dragged with a hook through his nose into Nineveh before the emperor. Now, the Assyrians invaded Judah too. They actually besieged the city of Jerusalem during the time of Hezekiah. But if you recall, God intervened. He sent an angel who wiped out the entire army of the Assyrians. And the Assyrian emperor behind that debacle was assassinated by his own sons in Nineveh because they felt such a loss of faith. How could the Assyrians lose a battle to this tiny little kingdom of Judah, just a little speck in the map? Couldn't take the city of Jerusalem. Even the Babylonians would take them several tries before they would succeed. So Judah had some topographical, geographical advantages why they were able to survive, but also because there were some good kings, so God protected them. And you remember the story of how God sent an angel, 185,000 soldiers of Assyria. That is a very, very large army in those days. The Assyrians thought for sure. The Assyrians even employed psychological warfare to try and discourage Hezekiah and the people of Judah to surrender. In the end, it was the Assyrians who lost. And that marked the decline of the Assyrian kingdom, that loss. So the punishment for Israel is you'll be gone. You'll be gone from history. Now, as I said earlier, they did not totally disappear from history. Many of the Israelites got absorbed into Judah. Many of them probably got mixed up with the Jews who ended up in Babylon and Persia. Many of them may have immersed themselves into the tribes where they were sent by the Assyrians. Some of them may actually have migrated further places, like the evidence that some of the tribe of Gads, the so-called Gadites or Gadarenes in the New Testament, may have actually migrated to Spain. There are many Spanish names, especially place names, particularly in the southeastern part of Spain, including the island territory of Mallorca and so on, that have names beginning with the word Gad in their language. That's one of the evidences that Gad may have actually reached there. Some Gadites may have actually reached that place, but we have to wait for more archaeological evidence to establish that. And so Amos told these kingdoms that all of them would be removed from the map. All of them would be removed from the map. The only one where that did not happen is Judah, because with Judah, and by extension Israel, all the descendants of Abraham, there is a counter promise in all the prophets. There's an inkling of it here in Amos, in these early 8th century Amos, Joel, Hosea, and that is a prophecy known to Old Testament scholars as the gathering. God told Israel, particularly Judah, that I'm going to send you, and wherever you go, it is because of me. So when the Jews arrived in Babylon and they were like, oh, what's the point now? By the rivers of Babylon we sat and wept. You know that psalm. Jeremiah wrote a letter. God says, you are here because it is my will. Do not be discouraged. Make sure that you settle down well, grow yourselves in number, make a good life for yourself. And I know the plans I have for you. When the time comes, I will bring you back to the land. And the prophets, all of the prophets, have these prophecies about the gathering. So while the Edomites would disappear, the Philistines would disappear, the Canaanites would disappear, the Israelites and the Jewish people would go into exile. They would be scattered and dispersed all around, but they would then be gathered back. And therein lies the seed of modern history. Because by the time the Jewish diaspora ended and Jews were able to return to their ancestral homeland, that homeland had been conquered by more than one Muslim empire. First, the Caliphate from Baghdad, the Mamluks from Egypt, then the Seljuk Turks, and of course the Ottoman empires from Turkey, who ruled for 400 years the land. And the thing about history is every time there is a conquest, people from that conquering kingdom would move into the conquered lands. And sometimes this was done intentionally, like the Assyrians and the Babylonians. At other times it happens because that's what people do. Now the Hittites came from southwest Turkey. They invaded the land of Israel, or the land of Canaan, before Israel appeared on the scene. And a lot of Hittites ended up settling in the land. And Abraham actually had to buy a piece of property from a man who was a Hittite so he could bury Sarah when she died. And people wondered, what are the Hittites doing? The Bible is wrong for saying that there are Hittites in the world, until, of course, archaeological excavation discovered the city of Bogaskoy and the Hittite Empire. So the Bible records Hittites who had settled down in Canaan, southern Canaan, far away from Turkey, at the time of Abraham. We know of the Apiru people, who we now know are the Hebrews, who had settled down in Egypt. The Hyksos, who came from Asia, even ruled Egypt. And so humans have always been migrating from one place of the world. Think of the Indo-Aryan migration, the um, Malayan, Indo-Chinese migrations, the Bantu migrations, the two biggest ones in history, the Aryan migration and the Bantu migration, one in Africa, one in Asia and Europe. And so who is a real Indian? Who is a real Pakistani? Who is a real Persian? Who is a real Egyptian? Do you know that none of the modern day Egyptians have genetic connections to the ancient Egyptians? Those people disappeared from history and completely replaced by an Arab population that came with Islam. And so you have this happening all over the world. The only people in the world who can trace connection to a land for thousands of years are the descendants of Abraham. Now, since the Arabs also claim descendants from Abraham, the contestation becomes a contest of inheritance. Bible says that God gave the land as an inheritance to Abraham. The Quran says that God gave the land as an inheritance to Ishmael. So you can see what happens when you have two sons claiming inheritance of the same piece of property. You know what happens in rich families when the mother or the father who was very rich dies. Even though a will may have been made, the siblings will go to war with each other to try and underwrite and undo the will so that, I can get the inheritance. This was the problem between Edom and Israel as well. And so the real conflicts between these nations around then and now is about inheritance. Because throughout history, somebody has claimed inheritance of the land. Now, when the prophets came around and told Israel and Judah that you are going to be removed from this land that God gave as an inheritance to Abraham unto you, this was the biggest shock to the system, politically, economically, spiritually, but especially to the terms of the covenant. So when the Jews landed in Babylon, they were like people who had been given a shock and brought back to life and suddenly realized we are here because we have broken the covenant. And so they would change their own history as a consequence of that. So the prophecy of the gathering would be the reversal of that. See, God did not intend the exiles, the diasporas, to be permanent, but punitive. And with the punishment, there must be a redemption. And so they will be brought back to the land. Now, prophets like Ezekiel, if you recall from Ezekiel, prophesied that this regathering of Israel back to their land of inheritance from God will agitate the world to such an extent that all the nations of the world will rise up against Israel. But when you read the nations that are listed in Ezekiel, you discover a very disturbing pattern, that the nations that will rise up and form this hyper coalition against Israel are descendants of Japheth, son of Noah, and Ham, son of Noah. Shem, the main descendants of Shem, the first son of Noah, are the Jewish people today. All the other descendants of Shem have disappeared in history. And here's the funny thing of this history, that almost all the descendants of Japheth belong to what we now call Christian countries, have been Christian for 2000 years. All the descendants of Ham today, in today's world, belong to Islam. And it's very discomforting for me as an Old Testament Bible teacher to see what's happening in the world, how the Christian West and the Muslim world are turning against Israel. It's like living through the prophecies of Ezekiel. Now, Adventists try to get around this dilemma by saying, oh, these prophecies were not intended to be physically fulfilled since Israel walked away from the covenant, or God chose another Israel, a spiritual Israel. I wish it was that simple, because prophecies of the Bible usually have multiple layers. But I'm putting this out there so that you remember that current geopolitics is really a byproduct of biblical prophecies. What is happening in today's world has been foretold thousands of years ago before that they would actually take place. I believe that there will actually be a physical aspect of fulfillment as well as an eschatological apocalyptic aspect of fulfillment of what Ezekiel spoke concerning all the nations turning against Israel. You know that right now even America is turning against Israel. And the Americans have told Israel, you listen to us and do what we want you to do, or else we will withdraw our support. Now, that has never ever happened in history. In the last Security Council motion, the US abstained, didn't even vote. It's a very strange world, but if you look it through the lens of the prophets, this was foretold. This is what will happen. Amos reminds these people, you will lose the land because of your unfaithfulness to God, but because of God's faithfulness to the covenant, he will bring you back to the land. And despite the fact that this would cause havoc in world history, God saw, looking thousands of years into the future, how much havoc these prophecies would cause, but they're there in the Bible. So Christians have a choice, ignore them or try to understand them, and then try to understand contemporary history through the lens of the Bible prophecy. Amos is one of them. They will go into exile, but they will be brought back to the land. The land God promised to Abraham will be kept within the house of Abraham, God said, for eternity, or at least until the Messiah comes. And so something for us to chew on. Next week, we will look at chapters 3, 4, and 5. So because they are clustered together. And if you remember from our introduction last week, they are introduced, all three chapters introduced by the same formula. So they are referring to more or less the same thing. He now moves away from the other nations. That was not really the interest of the prophets, never has been, using that only to circle into the main point. So much of the coming chapters deal with Israel and Judah specifically. All right, let me close the recording.